Hello, this video is the history of Russia. Can you see me very well? So the history of Russia. Russia is the biggest country in the world, sixth most populated country in the world, and it's a very interesting country because of that. It's got all kinds of looking people there. It's got mainly the whiteys. Those are the people who are in control of it, the ones who made Moscow, which took over all of Russia. But you got the yellows, the Asians. And then you got all the weird people who are kind of in between, like weird looking motherfuckers, like that actor Timothy Hutton, people like that, like people who are like, you must have Ching Chang in you. I guess people accuse me of having Ching Chang in me. So just all kinds of weird races like that. But it's a weird place because it's got all that different culture. But it's kind of a fucked up place too, so let's analyze that. So let's start at the beginning. The beginning of Russia. Russia was just a bunch of barbarians back in the time of like the Roman Empire. And barbarians don't have written language, so we don't really know much about them. But they were probably just a bunch of dudes up on horseback riding from hither to thither. Doing their thing. And then we start kind of hearing about people who live up there, barbarians coming down in the Roman Empire. The Visigoths weren't Russian. They kind of migrated from Lithuania through like Poland and like, like Czech Republic and stuff. And so they didn't really go in Ukraine or whatever. They didn't really go into Russia. So Russia was still kind of invisible, just like barbarians. Attila the Hun traveled through Russia. Attila was somewhere out there. He was a Ching Chang looking dude. We don't know how Ching Chang he was, but maybe halfway Ching Chang. So maybe he was a Turk, like a Cossack or whatever. Anyway, one of those. Russia, I guess he was a Russian, Chinese looking. Because a lot of those white Russians look kind of Ching Chang-y, like Boris Yeltsin kind of has the Ching Chang type eyes and like the round head, different kind of white. That's the white that has Genghis Khan in it. But so I would say Attila the Hun was the first Russian, and he came in and wreaked havoc upon Rome. Kind of in the latter days, like in the 380s, like the early 4s or the 380s. I can't remember exactly when. Causing problems. I mean, he set up base like around modern day Hungary, or like Croatia, Slovenia, like Hungary type area. And he had kind of his own kingdom, that the Romans didn't go into. He was his own. He had his own like town, and the Byzantinians had to give him like 2,000 pounds of gold every year just to keep out of their town. And then he had a big battle with the Romans in France, which was like one of the biggest battles ever. It waged way into the night. Thousands of people died. And then Rome kept the battlefield, but Attila escaped, and the Huns were still around. And then he died, and then the Huns kind of, that was kind of pretty much around the fall of the Roman Empire. So the Huns, I think, started Hungary. I think that's why Hungary is called Hungary. They kind of moved into Hungary, and that's why Hungary has their own language. Kind of similar to Finland. It's just an independent language, and it's because it came from somewhere out there in Russia somewhere. All those people came from somewhere where they speak totally different, and all moved in with Attila the Hun, and then started Hungary. So he was the first Russian we know about. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire, and the beginning of all the different European countries, Russia was still way out there in the outskirts. It was like the land of the barbarians, because it was just so far out there, and there were lots of horses, but not that many trees, I guess. Or I guess there were trees, but a lot of that, I haven't been there, but a lot of it is just grassland, so you can't like build cities and stuff with it. So it's just a bunch of people on horses just wandering all around. So it's not really breeding ground for society. So it's, you know, barbarians. But then in 790, all of the Scandinavians came down. There was a population explosion up there. There are population explosions from time to time coming out of the far north, is where population explosions come out of more than anywhere else, and I think it's because way up north up there, the seasons vary a lot. So, you know, you can have bad season, then all of a sudden you have a really good season, or a couple of really good seasons, you got too many people, and all of a sudden those people have to, you know, bust a nut on down south, and then there's wars because they got to invade other people's territory. So anyways, this happened back in 790 was when the first raid happened on Lindisfarne, which was a monk. And all these badass Vikings who were in shape from probably fighting people back up in, you know, their native Norway and stuff, and then rowing their boats down the fjords and across the straits and, you know, hacking apart trees to make their own huts, and just these badass in shape Vikings who didn't give a fuck about killing somebody because they were pissed off about leaving their home country. Killed all those monks, whipped their asses, and was just sitting on their asses all day, those little pussy-ass monks. Up in Ireland in Lindisfarne. And then they were like, ooh, easy booty. So they went nuts, and they came down here and took over like all of Europe. They pretty much took over England, but I guess I don't want to get too sidetracked. They went into Russia. And Russia's was a great place to go into because, well, it's right next to Scandinavia. It's just as far north. So they only had to kind of move over to the west, and so they had all this expanse. And Russia's got lots of really big rivers because they got, big, I guess, big mountains in the Caucasus over there or whatever. They're running and flowing north all over the place. And so they got in their Viking ships, and they could just row their boats up these rivers. And they inhabited Russia. So that was pretty much the beginning of Moscow. Was founded by Vikings. So these, you know, white people, Scandinavians, Vikings, and maybe we even went into Ukraine and started Kiev. Maybe started by Vikings. I don't really remember. I know some of the original inhabitants of Ukraine, and maybe even Kiev. I can't remember the story of Kiev. I think Kiev was founded by a woman, but anyways, some original Ukrainians were the survivors from the Trojan War when Troy fell. Aeneas went to Rome, and then some of them went up into Ukraine, but Vikings started Russia basically. So that was kind of the beginnings of Russia being part of Europe and being like a recognized, you know, extreme eastern part of Europe that people knew, you know, it was white people who, and this is later on in the history, like the early medieval ages, where they all had their common religion. So it was more of a tight-knit community, pretty much like a grand country, you know, like the inheritor of the Roman Empire. Now it was a big kind of loosely knit grand country known as the Christendom. You know, and their boss is the Pope and stuff. So, and the edge of Christendom was these Vikings. And the Vikings of Russia, they were already savages because they were the ones who'd been terrorizing Europe. And probably savages just for being way out there and not being as kind of like hillbilly bumpkins, country bumpkins types. And so they lived out there for a few hundred years, but then, you know, in the early 1200s, we've all heard of the dude Genghis Khan. He was the Mongolian, way out there in Mongolia. And due to some weird changes of events, and maybe from a population explosion, I don't know, but anyways, weird chain of events, the Mongolians all unified. All the different tribes of Mongolia unified through all these different wars, just conquering people over and over again into one giant warrior battle. Like moving army. And they moved across Russia from China, across Transoxiana and Russia, and took over Europe. So I would say that's another big step of Russia, because and that probably, the Mongols might probably deserve their own video, but I'll include it in Russia because they had a really big effect on Russia. They pretty much besieged Kiev. They besieged Moscow, defeated everybody. I mean, everybody they went in contact with, they kicked their asses. They completely overthrew the Persian empire of the day, who I can't remember, but they kicked their asses and deposed them and burnt all their books and basically took over the whole country. They took over China, turned into the Yuan Empire. They invaded Japan twice, but both times their weather turned them back, and then they gave up. They even invaded Vietnam. And they kicked the asses of the Polish, killed 30,000 Polish knights, because they were just better warriors. Everybody, they thought they were like the traditional civilized types, but these guys were just pure warriors. And a lot of their war technology was even better. Back then you had knights who were dressed up in forged like iron, I guess, or metal, in those big knight outfits with the metal. And then they had those chainmail shirts on, and the chainmail shirts would weigh like up to 60 pounds just by themselves, and the big helmets and stuff. And they would fight each other like that. And I think that was a good way to fight if you were like one like cop, one knight going after a bunch of peasants who weren't fighters, and you could fight off like 7 peasants at a time, and then you could fight your other knight jousting, and it was kind of like this honor thing, like, we have the same technology, and then we fight each other, and whoever wins gets to own the whole area type of thing. But I don't know, I'm not so sure if that was like the greatest way to have like a whole army of people fight like that. Well, you couldn't afford to have everybody in the army dressed like that, but when you had like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these Mongolians, they didn't really stand a chance. The Mongolian army were so big that they could go across the whole plains, like a whole valley, where it was like 10 miles between the mountains. And they could just go abreast, horse abreast. And each Mongolian had 6 horses when they traveled. And so they could herd new herds of horses and herd whatever field animal there are for them to do whatever they want with, eat them and stuff, just from being across like that, because there were so many of those warriors. And they ate raw meat, and they would, like, when they kill an animal, instead of cooking it, they'd just throw it on the top of their horse, and they'd ride on top of it and let the sun beat it, and then their body beating it as they ride on top of it, and then just eat it raw, like turn it into beef jerky. When their horses gave birth, they'd eat the placenta raw. When they get scabs and like lice would eat their hair, they just eat the lice. And they're from Mongolia, so they knew how to make silk, and they had silk shirts. So when they got shot, the arrow would go in their body, but they would just pull the arrow out because the silk would envelop the arrow, and so they wouldn't get infected and suffer as much. They could like keep on fighting if they got shot. So that was kind of like their armor, just a whole bunch of silk shirts on. And their arrows were better. Their arrows could shoot a half mile, and the best crossbow at the time could only shoot like a quarter mile. The best European crossbow. And their arrows could go like, their arrows were normal arrows, so they could shoot arrow after arrow after arrow, whereas the crossbow took like a longer time to reload because they had to like crank it and stuff. So, yeah, so they were basically on the verge of taking over Poland and then maybe taking over all of Europe. But one of their great khans died, and so they went back to find out who would be the next khan. And After that, they never got the resources to go back and attack Europe at that level. But they were planning on attacking Europe. They had emissaries go to the Pope and back, and the Pope was like, please become Christian and stuff. And he'd be like, you bow down to me, I will not bow down to your God. You bow down to me, I am your God now. Genghis Khan said that. And so they took over Russia, and but they didn't like take over Russia the way that they took over the Middle East. The Middle East, they took over Middle East. Like, they killed everybody. Because the Middle Easterns wanted to fight. And they told them if they fought, they'd just kill all of them. And they decided to fight, so all of them got killed, and they took over their country. So now in the Middle East, you got a lot of ching-chang-looking people. Whereas if they hadn't have done that, maybe they'd still be white. Like, back then, there were a lot more white than they are now. A lot less ching-chang. Because the Middle East were descendants from, Alexander the Great, the Greeks, and other, like, white people and stuff. It's a VW van. But with Russia, what they did is they would just, like, make them give them money. Kind of like what Attila the Hun did with Byzantinians. They would just make them give them money. So they would give them money. They'd have to pay all the princes of Kiev, of Ukraine, and then the Moscow would have to pay them money. And every year. And so they would just cart all of this gold back to their primitive town. I can't even remember what it's called, but it's just like, I mean, if you look at it now, you can barely even see there was anything there. Their walls are just like piles of mud. Because it was just like brick muds built around just giant grass plain where there's no trees. They probably still lived in tents. I know when the Yuan dynasty in China, they made their buildings and stuff in their court actually look like tents to make them feel more at home. So they were called the Golden Horde. I think the ones who were terrorizing Russia, the Moscow, were called the Golden Horde because they had so much gold. They just carted gold there. But as time went on, they kind of became more tame and turned into like just another khaganate. And and then Russia, the country capital in Moscow, started to become more civilized and be able to, utilize, have an identity with Western Europe and utilize the technological developments and stuff. And so then they slowly took over the Khanates again. The Tatars, the descendants of the Mongols, and ended up taking over that whole area, and so that's why Russia is so big. But it was a slow process, and but a lot of the culture from the Tatars came into Moscow and Russia. So I think that's why they're just kind of barbaric. Now, I think the first, like, unifier that I can think of Russia really was, like, Ivan the Terrible. And he was this, like, crazy dude. This is, like, he was, like, early 1500s. He was, like, around the same time as, late 1500s, like, the same time as Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. I think he wanted to marry Queen Elizabeth. And if you see pictures, like paintings of him, portraits, he was just really mean looking, like mean and crazy looking, and maybe even like officially insane. And I guess he wanted absolute rule, and no, because they did kind of have a parliament there, but he was like, I guess being in control, but then I think he was religious, like a Catholic, and he was trying to get control, but people wouldn't listen to him, and he'd have to kill a bunch of people, and he was really ruthless and killed a whole bunch of people, but then he got sick of killing people, and he just abdicated, and he left, and he wanted to become a monk. Like this really violent dude who killed all these people when they become a monk. But then they couldn't find a new successor. Like it was just a bunch of people killing each other. And I guess that's a weird thing about Russia. Like it's really hard for them to find a king, a leader, because it's just, if you don't have one leader, then it's just like a bunch of like I don't know, like cavemen, like really just savages just killing each other, and then it's just chaos. So they value really, they want one leader more than, they can't deal with having lots of different leaders around. They want to have one big leader for the big area. And maybe that's something that they inherited from the Mongols, because the Mongols had one big leader for that huge area, like the biggest land empire ever. So I think they asked him to come back, but he's like, I will only come back and be czar again if I get to be absolute ruler. So they let him come back to be absolute ruler, and I think he ruled absolutely and just was ruthless and killed a bunch of people. But he ended up being king his whole life. But he didn't get to pass his dynasty on. His dynasty died with him because he killed his only son. Because his only son, like, he said something rude to his son's wife. And the son, I think he didn't like his son's wife because she was like Lithuanian or something. And so the son was like, you don't talk to my wife like that. And he's like, what? You don't talk to me like that. So he bashed him across the head with his scepter a few times. I guess beat his brains out, killed his son. So yeah, that was no more dynasty from Ivan the Terrible. And when he died, they found out that all of his vertebrae in his back were fused together, so he could like barely walk. He was like this. So he wasn't a very happy camper. And some people, like, he's on the list of insane monarchs, so some people think, I guess, he was crazy. But then he had like then there was somebody else, and then there was somebody else. And then there was this time called the Time of Troubles, which was like from like 1598 to like 1613, when they couldn't find a leader. Like they had, one dude came and I don't know what happened to when some czar was like 3 czars after Ivan the Terrible, was a czar for 14 years, but then I guess he disappeared. Like nobody, Russia's so big that nobody really knows what's going on. So I guess some other dude came back and said he was the czar who was the czar before for like 3 years, but it turned out that he was just a Polish dude who claimed to be czar. And then they found out after him being the czar for like 3 years or something. And there's a Russian movie called 1516 or 1612 that tells that story with a lot of, liberal imaginings. But what they did, they killed him, and then they cremated him and blew his ashes back in the direction of Poland in a cannon. And then there was another guy who was an imposter, and then there was a couple other guys who were just like czar for a really short time. And then there was one guy, and I don't know how they found him. Maybe because he claimed descendancy or something from Ivan or something like that. But he was some Romanov. So that was the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which lasted from like 1613 all the way up to 1918. So for like more than 300 years, it was a dynasty in Russia, which was the dynasty, the Romanov dynasty, that was in control of Russia as absolute monarchists for the emergence of Russia as a big city, as a big country. And so they had this first dude, something or other Romanov, and then they had his son, like Alexei, and then his son, like Alexei II. And then his son was, and then it was like two brothers who were ruling together, Peter the Great and some other dude. And the other dude died after like 14 years of being a czar. Peter the Great got to be czar for like a long time, like 30 years or something like that. I think there was a coup when he was like 8 and he almost died or whatever, or thought he was going to get killed, but then the coup didn't survive. So then maybe he became king along with his older brother when he was really young. But Peter the Great, he's one of the greats, one of the great leaders, because he was the one who brought Russia up to snuff with Europe. Before that, like in the days of Ivan the Terrible and then the time of troubles, and Russia wasn't really like a country the way other countries were. It was just like this. It was just way out there in Moscow, Far East. People were just like trying to have a country, but not really very successful at it, just because it's so big and loosely knit that you'd have one guy say, "Oh yeah, I'm the boss," and then the other guy, "No, I'm the boss," and so they just a lot of wars and not a lot of communication with civilized Europe. So they were just behind in technology developments and religion. They were all Catholic and stuff, but there was probably a different kind of Catholicism. All of their priests were dressed in really long beards, and even the people at court, the kings and stuff, had really long beards. Probably how the barbarians would have their hair. We know the Celts had the really long beards and stuff, probably because they didn't have the wealth to be cutting and shaving, so they just and they probably dressed really simply and were very superstitious. I think Russians generally are really superstitious, and just a lot more tied in with like ancient shamanic religion, which is fine religion to have, but it does bring in a lot more superstitions. And so they have tales of like the unicorns and of the... There's even a book right now called Anastasia. It's about this Russian dude who supposedly, like in a couple of years ago, back in like 1995 or something, took a boat up into northern Russia and found some like hippie chick who fucked his brains out on the first night, had a baby with him, but she could like run 60 miles an hour uphill. She could talk to bears and slept with a leopard in her, and all these crazy stories, like how her parents were killed because they broke off a tree of the magic tree, but it sent a laser beam into her parents' head, and then there's people up there who live for hundreds of years because they drink drinks from the magical oaks up there, and just that kind of stuff. I'm not gonna say what I think about that book because I already read that book. I think it's a cool book and great philosophy and stuff, but I'm not so sure I can believe it just based on how people like that up there are superstitious. And so anyways, Peter the Great was the dude who came and brought Western civilization to them. So he built St. Petersburg. I think after he conquered the Swedes, and I think that was their first port. Russia for the longest time didn't even have an ocean. They had the North Sea up there, but it was always frozen, so it wasn't a sea. It was just like the expanse of like whiteness that you can't go up into northern Siberia. So he had a battle with Sweden. Sweden back then and before then was the biggest country in Europe, the most powerful country in Europe. And they owned Finland and Norway and maybe even like the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and they got their asses. He got his ass kicked by the Swedes, but then he built up a big army, and he was the first Russian to kick the Swedes' asses. So yeah, he kicked the Swedes' asses. Peter the Great, back in like early 1600s, 1650s. Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry, 1682 to 1722. So early 1700s. They got their St. Petersburg, and it's still a Russian state now, even though it's not connected to the rest of Russia. And that's why it's called St. Petersburg, because he built it, and he helped actually build the ships and stuff with his bare hands, with the people. And so he oversaw the navy, and he was the first. See, early 1700s, it's kind of the beginning of like Renaissance. You had the Renaissance men and like 1500s where people would be interested in lots of different things and they could do lots of stuff. And so he was the first Russian Renaissance man. He was interested in everything. He learned how to read. I think maybe he was maybe the first Russian king to learn how to read and write. And he learned how to make boats, and he became like an amateur of everything. Like even like medical stuff. He had his court, and all of his guys come and watch the dissection of a corpse, and they were really superstitious about that. Like, you don't touch a body. But he's like, enough of that superstitious shit. You don't touch a body or else you get the heebie-jeebies. So he made everybody take a bite out of a dead body in order to get rid of their fear. He's like, snap out of it, guys. And then he built a whole big navy. And then he did a tour all over Western Europe to say hi, to introduce Russia to the rest of Western Europe. Only when he do the tour, he liked to pretend that he was just another sailor. And so he would like command his boat and his fleet and stuff, but he didn't want to be called the Tsar while he was traveling. He wanted to be called Captain. And so and then he'd go out there like false names and stuff, and then when they found out he was the Tsar, he would be the Tsar and stuff. But it was kind of, once people knew who he was, it was kind of hard for him to hide because he was 6'7" in early 1700s, so that was really big for back then, I guess. And he was really weird looking too. When he talked, he'd do this. He had a tick where he'd move his mouth up, and I guess he shook his head and stuff, and blinked a lot when he talked. So he was like, and had like really small feet and small hands. So he stumbled around a lot. And he was a total wasteoid. He get wasted all the time. So he was stumbling around. And when he met, people had like meetings and stuff with people in all the other courts in Europe. He totally freaked them out. They thought that he had no manners at all. I guess that's just what like Russians were like. They were just like Vikings. They're descendants of Vikings and Tatars. So they just get wasted and like eat with their bare hands and belch and wipe their hands on their shirt and just be like, and then whenever they'd put him up in one of their chalets or whatever, he'd leave it totally destroyed. Like smash out all the windows, tear all the curtains off, knock down the tables and leave. But he traveled with a really big entourage. He had, because he wanted to turn it into like a fact-finding mission to come back and try to bring Russia up to the level of Western Europe. And so he brought all the best technicians of everybody. But he also brought a big group of midgets with him, of dwarves. And yeah, so I think he went to like the countries in Scandinavia, England and stuff. He went to Rome. He was a Catholic. And then he was visiting Austria. But then when he was in Austria, he'd been gone for maybe like years or something. And when a king is gone for that long, you can get people who try to usurp their power. For whatever reason. Maybe they thought he wasn't serious about being the Tsar and he was just taking advantage of the wealth that he had. And so people were like, fuck this guy, we're going to take over. But so supposedly there were some nobles who wanted to overthrow Peter the Great, and they were going to put his son, Alexei, in power. And Alexei went along with it. So Peter got word of it and then rushed back to Russia and then like put all those nobles to death and then got his son and imprisoned his son. And until his son died of like exposure of like being frozen to death, or he got like tuberculosis and they whipped him and stuff. And so his son died. And I don't think he had a child after that to carry on his dynasty. Or his blood. But he didn't really like his son anyway, because he was just this like little, like weak, physically weak, like stupid kid who wasn't interested in stuff. And he even told his father, he's like, I'm not interested. I don't have the strong countenance as you. I just want to have mellow life. And he's like, if you want to be Tsar, you must be interested in all of these subjects. And so I guess it wasn't so much of a bother for him to kill his son. So there's the second Tsar we know of who killed their son after Ivan the Terrible. But when he came back to Russia, he brought all the technology with him. And that's when he made all of the Russian priests shave their beards. And he was really aggressive about it. He wasn't like, oh, shit, I think you should shave your beard. He'd run up to them and yank the hair out of their faces by his own hands and say, "Ah, you take the rest of that face off. Take the rest of that hair off. We're going to become civilized now." So he brought like more technology. I don't know exactly what technology. Better boats, better war technology, cannons and stuff, and had some wars. I think maybe he was the one who got access to the Black Sea, like conquering some of those parts of Ukraine. But so he died, and then he had one of his relatives took over, and then one of their relatives took over, and then there was a woman. I think her name was Catherine or Isabella or something, who was in charge of the country. And so she was the first woman to be in charge of Russia, and this was like in the late 1700s. And then she didn't have any children because she was like the sister of the other guy, Tsar. So maybe she didn't plan on being Tsarina, but she didn't have any children. So she decided to have like one of her, because all of these different royal families are interrelated. So she got one of her relatives from Prussia, which was modern day Germany, to come out and be the prince. And his name was Peter something, like Peter III or something. And then they had him marry the other girl, who then changed her name to like Catherine, and she was from Prussia as well. So now the next two czars who were going to be czars of Russia were actually Germans, which wasn't anything new. Back in the time of troubles, like between 1610 and 1612, there was a Polish guy who was in charge of Russia. So his czar was actually Polish. But yeah, so that lady died. And this dude, Peter III, became czar. But nobody liked him. He was a real idiot. And if you see pictures of him, like drawings of him, he looks like a complete doofus. He looks like Pee Wee Herman, only like 10 times retarded. Maybe he was retarded, like from inbreeding, you know. Maybe some of those royal family members actually became retarded from being inbred so much. Because he just looked like a doof. He had no chin, really big nose, and he was just like, hey. And yeah, he like when he was a child with the girl, Catherine, as his young wife, he would force her to march up and down the room, pretending to be one of his soldiers, and he'd have these big toys set up and play battles. And once she came in the room and he was hanging a mouse, and she said he was being executed for treason. The mouse was. But he wasn't the first like czar to be interested in war games. Actually, Peter the Great did that. When Peter the Great was a child, I think, before he was even czar, he was a prince. He'd get all the other kids together and have these war games. And they'd use real cannons, only they'd put fake cannonballs in, like lumps of leather or something like that. And they'd besiege each other's towns, and they'd shoot at each other and and hack at each other. In one of these war games, 22 of the kids died. Yeah, so Russians are pretty barbaric. They're like Vikings. Mix a Viking with a Mongolian and you get a Russian. So anyways, there was this dude, Peter III, and he didn't like Russia. I guess he thought Russia was barbaric, and he was German. So he wanted to pretend that he was still in Germany. And I think he was even planning on getting an army together to attack Prussia, to annex Prussia into Germany, and then so basically turn Russia into Germany. because he made all of the Russian priests dressed in the blue color. No, well, they made them all dress like the German priests dress. And then he made all of the Russian soldiers dress in blue, in the color of the Prussian, dressed just like the Prussian soldiers. And yeah, he didn't learn Russian, and he refused to learn Russian, and only talked to German, so he couldn't communicate with the other Russians. And meanwhile, his wife, Catherine, who didn't like him at all, but they did have a baby together. But it's debatable whether she was his, if the baby was the son of Peter. But she could actually learn. She learned Russian. She was supposed to be really smart, and she learned Russian, and she made friends with all the Russian top dudes, when this other dude wasn't. So she went along with a coup, where all those other dudes just stormed their castle and captured the dude, the czar, and killed him. And they liked her, so they just made her Tsarina. And that wasn't the first time that a woman had been in control of Russia. The one right before him was a woman, so they'd been used to that. So she became Tsarina, and she was Catherine the Great. And she was in power for a long time, I think, for like 40 years or something. Or 30 years or something like that, 33 years or something. And she was kind of like, they were calling her Catherine the Great while she was still alive. And I think she said, like, oh, don't call me Catherine the Great, I'm still alive, that's ridiculous. But she was a great Tsarina because she was really interested in the Enlightenment. And she brought a lot of like artwork from the rest of Europe in there into Russia, and she brought lots of Bibles in there, and decorated the palace like Western European countries. Well, she was German, but she did it with respect to the Russians, because she could speak Russian. And when she got sick and they were bleeding her with leeches, and she said, drop all of the rest of the German that I have in me. I am Russian now. Damn, I hope somebody's not needs to get air bagged out of Mount Shasta. No, it's not going to the mountain. I think it was close. Oh no, it looks like it's carrying fire water. There's not a fire up there. So, she was in Enlightenment. And I think she was even there, and but she got freaked out when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette got beheaded. She didn't like that. So she wasn't totally into like democracy and constitutional monarchy, but she was definitely interested in trying to help the peasants and stuff. And she grew the empire, I think, more than anybody, more than Peter the Great or anybody. She had battles where they took over the Ukraine and got parts of the Black Sea, and that's when Russia really grew in size. The late 1700s under Catherine the Great. And then she had a child, Alexei, who didn't really like her because she thought that he killed his dad, so he had her buried right next to him. And then there was like an Alexander or something, a couple more. And then you had the one in the last one in the 1910s during World War I. And this is decadence. It was the last remaining absolute monarchy in Europe, and it was kind of time to kind of phase that out and have a parliament, because this dude was just making really stupid decisions, and based on not any information, just because he was like, well, let's see, I want to be a great czar, so I guess I'll start a big war and I'll take over more territory, and that'll make me a great czar. So he sent his ships around the Cape Horn of Africa, 20,000 miles, to try and take a couple of like islands off of freaking Japan, instead of sending them on a land war out there. And they got their asses kicked by the Japanese, and it was like the Spanish Armada. They like lost their whole army. And then World War I happened, and they were doing really poorly in World War I. A lot of people died, and he wasn't a good leader. Like, he'd stand in front of the troops and just kind of like stand there and like look at him and then like walk off, wouldn't have anything to say. And so he didn't really have that aura of a leader, kind of like Louis XVI. People look at him and be like, This guy's the absolute monarch? What the hell? And then they had Rasputin. His wife liked Rasputin because he's like, your son will not die of hemophilia tonight one night when he was really sick. And he didn't die, so she thought it was because of him. He had like magical powers, and he was one of these like ancient like medicine men type dudes with the big beards, and then he was like raping all the aristocratic women, like, you know, all of the cultured ladies. He was just going in there and being stinky and dirty and just like raping them, and they were terrified of him, and so they kind of lost respect in their family. Thought they were a bunch of idiots, so they deposed him, had him in control under prisoners for like 6 months, then just shot them all down. But then a bunch of ladies started saying that they were the descendant of what's her name, Anastasia, the last princess. And there's one lady who like a lot of people thought that she was, and she moved to America, and it turned out that she wasn't when they did the DNA test on her after she died. But kind of shows how people get attached to monarchies like that. Bring the monarchy back. Oh no. The royal family, the right ruler. But then after that, you had Lenin, who went crazy. His face turned black. He got some kind of sickness. Who was a Marxist, communist. And then Stalin took over back in like 1917 or something, really early, and went nuts and just killed everybody. Killed like 60 million people or something. Sent a whole bunch of people up to... And Stalin was a bank robber. He was a criminal. And somehow he took over. I don't know, man. People like that, like just like ruthless types could take over Russia. And so he fucked Russia up real good. And then he died, and then they had some more dudes, Nikita Khrushchev. But then they when he lost, they'd send him to jail. They like banished him to Siberia or something. So the rumor has it that he wanted to kind of team up with Kennedy and end the World War I, or the Cold War, even though they had that showdown in the Bay of Pigs. But then, but then they had a couple more, and then Boris, what's his name, Gorbachev, ended USSR. He was a really good leader. But now we have Putin, who I guess is like another kind of like bad dude. But anyways, Russia will come around. Russia's gonna have like, there's some things more advanced about Russia than America. They're more into like nudity. Like those chicks tattoo, they're naked in a couple of their videos. And when they do shows, they wear like panties and like wet themselves down, dude. And you can see their nipples and their snatches. It's fucking crazy. Then there's like naked hippie communes up in Siberia, you know. And you got like those hippie, like Anastasia, those hippie people up there. And then the scientists are figuring out torsion fields and research into like pyramids and stuff. After they broke up the Cold War, they had all this extra money to use those scientists and stuff. So Russia will come around. Anyways, I'm out of time. My videos can't be longer than 50 minutes because it can only be 2 gigabytes. So, history of Russia.